Thanks very much for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here, and I enjoyed having some conversations with some of you over coffee yesterday and lunch and drinks to try and get a bit of a perspective of the things that you might, of the things about research that are puzzling you, troubling you, and unfortunately I'm not going to be addressing any of what anybody asked me to address. But hopefully what I'm going to do is going to be useful anyway. So I should make it clear that I'm coming to this entirely from a researcher perspective. I have worked with non-government organisations, mostly small, not very powerful ones, and have worked with the policy-making community. And I've been interested in how to bridge the no-do gap for a very long time. And for me, it's part of a broader interest in how we deal with complex problems. My interest is more in methodology than in content. Most researchers are interested in a topic. I'm interested in how we do things. And one of those how we do things is how do we get better interaction between researchers and policymakers, and it doesn't matter whether that's in health or policing or education or any other. I'm looking for universal methods. So that's just to give you a bit of a sense of where I'm coming from. I'm going to talk about 5 things, and I hope they'll be of some use. One of the things I'm going to talk about is the benefits and ingredients of research policy, or the no-do collaboration. Research policy, research practice, no-do collaboration. I'm going to talk a bit about what you might look for when you're trying to find a researcher to collaborate with. I'm going to pick up the challenge that Carl made, and I'm going to talk about the value of theory, because I know that there's a bit of, theory. So I'm going to try and give you some examples of how theory might be helpful. And then I'm going to give you some ideas for thinking about complexity, because I appreciate that you all work in very complex environments, and this is actually something we're not going to be good at, not very good at. And I'm going to finish by talking about some resources. So let's start with looking at the benefits of collaborating between the people who generate knowledge and the people who do things with that knowledge. There are basically 3 things that can come out of working together. The first is that it can help give an issue profile and legitimacy. So you often know that something's important, and what researchers can do is they can, by quantifying it, by seeing how many people are affected, can work with you to make governments aware of the problem, to make funders aware of the problem. So a long, long time ago, I was involved with the RSI epidemic. So women started, this was in the 1980s, predominantly women, started reporting symptoms from working on these newfangled computers that appeared on people's desks. And it was researchers coming in and saying, you know, about 1/3 of the workforce is affected by this problem, that helped get it onto the agenda and to make it a legitimate issue that people worried about. And sometimes researchers and practitioners will work together to become an advocacy voice. The second area of working together is to build a stronger knowledge base. So many of you are aware of working with researchers on needs assessment. And so the 2 things that you probably know about is needs assessment and evaluation. You probably have people coming in and evaluating, find out what works and what's cost effective. But generating other forms of knowledge is also a benefit of the collaboration. And here's where what Carl was saying about not only knowledge-led practice, but practice-based knowledge is really important. It's really important to work together, that you generate some issues that researchers can think about and researchers generate some issues that you can think about. And that's really relates also to the third issue, so that what the collaboration does is it provides new ideas for research based on your experience, it provides new ideas for practice based on what research has found, and the 2 together can often influence what's going to happen in policy. So they're the 3 things that you might think about if you're thinking about working with researchers. What is it that you want to get out of these 3 issues? Which of those do you want to work with them on? So the necessary ingredients, I'd argue, for both sides, for both the researchers and the practitioners, are that you know your stuff. So that when a collaboration works really well, when the practitioners are really aware across the field of practice and can be good guides for the researchers into the field of practice, and when the researchers are really across the field of research and can be good guides for the practitioners around what research can offer. It's always important to be humble, because none of us knows everything. And part of knowing your stuff is also knowing what you don't know and being upfront about that and not defensive or trying to hide that. It's important for both sides to have integrity. It's important for both sides to be able to reflect on what's happening, particularly when things aren't going particularly well. It's important to be able to deal with uncertainty because, as I'll talk about later, uncertainty pervades what we do. And it's important to be open to change. If we're not open to change, then working together to achieve change is going to be a tad difficult. One of the things that I realised was important in the conversations I had yesterday was that there are many different types of interactions. So some of you, and among the people I talked to yesterday, Julian Allen from Salisbury, was saying they don't actually have much direct involvement with researchers at all. They get their research through forums like this, that they hear what people are saying and that's when they pick things up. Whereas some people have researchers on staff, and I had a chat to Diane from Dubbo and she said, well, we've got somebody on staff whose job it is to do research. Other people have researchers come in to do particular projects, and Tracy from the city was somebody who I talked to about that, and she said, we have people coming in from Swinburne, they do particular projects, and they may or may not be useful for us, and then they go back to what we then do with the rest of our lives. And I guess the other model is that, and this was one that Belinda from Onkaparinga talked about, was a partnership approach. So really developing a long-term relationship and working together. So researchers can be on staff, researchers can come in to do projects, that can be doing evaluations. You can also have consultancy relationships where you actually determine what the researchers are going to do rather than it being a kind of a negotiated thing. You can say, we need somebody to do that, put out a consultancy, pay them to do what you want. So they're the kind of relationships that are possible between researchers and practitioners and researchers and policymakers, and you might think about which of those is going to be most beneficial for what you need in your service. Can I just get a sense from you about how many of you have actually worked with researchers in one capacity or other? Excellent. And how many of you found that to be a really terrific process? Not quite as many hands. All right, so what to look for when you're trying to collaborate with researchers? So the first thing is, what do you want to achieve? And that gets back to where I started. So do you want to give an issue profile and legitimacy? Are you trying to find out stuff? Do you want evaluation? Or are you trying to generate new ideas? Or are you trying to do all of the above? And let's think about what it takes to make a good match. It's important to understand what researchers are good at. And researchers are good at this list of things. We're good at figuring out how much of something there is. We're good at quantifying problems. We're good at gathering rich stories about a problem that usually duplicates what you've already done, but we're good at recording it and putting it into a form that can be put out into the world. We're good at examining cause and effect, and part of examining cause and effect is running randomised controlled trials. We're good at examining change over time. This is, longitudinal studies are now becoming more and more popular, but they're very expensive. We're good at developing explanatory theory. We're good at evaluation. We're good at doing comparative analysis, comparing this with that. That's really where randomised controlled trials are important as well. And we're good at doing cost-benefit analysis. But not every researcher is good at every one of those things. It depends on the discipline. And one of the areas where you get discontent is if the researcher who comes in has a skill set that doesn't match the needs of the problem that you'd like to see investigated. And figuring out how to match that skill set is an important part of the conversation to make the collaboration helpful. What we're not so good at is the kinds of things that I'm really working on. We're not particularly good at dealing with complexity. We're not particularly good at understanding systems. And the Productivity Commissioner, Robert Fitzgerald, yesterday talked about the importance of systems. He talked about when you set up a policy that insulates the person who's affected with service providers and alienates the family and community, you're actually intervening in a system and you're making a systems change that's not actually beneficial for the person. Researchers aren't yet very good at helping you think about that sort of stuff. We're not very good at actually bringing together different kinds of knowledge. We talk a lot about it, we know that it's important, but we're not actually very good yet at how to do it. We're not very good at helping deal with values conflict, and you'll know in your own work that the conflict in values is often a really critical part of what you do. We're not very good at dealing with what we don't know, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. We're not very good at understanding context, and Robert Fitzgerald talked about the importance of that yesterday too. And we're not very good at bridging the no-do gap. So we're not very good at understanding change. We're not very good at doing things like action research. I'm not saying that there's nobody who does that, but these are areas where research, if you think about it, there's an imbalance. So the first slide that I showed you, there are lots of people who are good at doing this kind of stuff, that kind of stuff, quantifying research, doing randomised controlled trials, all that. This kind of stuff, there aren't very many people who are good at doing it. And that's a major issue in terms of trying to work together, because these are the things that you are often interested in trying to do. So when you're trying to build a partnership with researchers, it's important to think about what it is that you want and what the person can provide and how you can develop the best possible match. It's also worth thinking about what motivates researchers. So we've got some innate motivations. One of them is curiosity, and I talked to Tabitha from Logan yesterday, and she said, I just want to know things. I reckon I'd make a really good researcher. Well, you would, because that's what we are on about. We just want to know things. We're usually quite passionate about the topic. We really get quite invested in understanding this or that or whatever it is that we're working on. We've often got a commitment to excellence. We're often quite committed to advancing our academic discipline or field. We are often quite committed to making a difference, and we're often quite ambitious, and we might also be quite competitive. So it's worth understanding what it is that drives us. It's also worth understanding what our reward system is. So we get rewarded for getting funding, and especially Category 1 grants, and what that means is getting funding from the National Health and Medical Research Council and the Australian Research Council. Those are highly competitive granting agencies. We also get rewarded for publishing. We get rewarded for publishing, particularly in high impact journals, the journals that lots of people read. Not lots of ordinary people, lots of academics read. So we get rewarded for journals that get highly cited by other academics. We also get rewarded for the number of PhD students who finish. At the moment we're getting rewarded for the number of bums on seats, but that's actually about to change, and PhD students need to finish, not just be there. They're our three primary drivers. We also get it, there's starting to be a trend towards thinking about that we should get rewarded for impact, and that's actually going to be really good for research practice collaboration. And we also get rewarded for teaching excellence, which is not particularly relevant to what I'm talking about today. So the challenge for us as researchers is to marry our innate motivations, the stuff that drives us, with what we get rewarded for. And good researchers need to be able to blend those two things. The reason for telling you that is to help you understand where we're coming from and to help you understand what it is that you might do to make it more possible for us to do what we need to do, both to satisfy our innate motivations and to satisfy what we need to do to get rewarded in the system. It's also worth saying something about researchers, the difference between researchers and consultants. I ran a group a few years ago where I brought together a bunch of researchers and a small number of consultants to think about how different disciplines and different areas of practice think about the unknown. And there was real tension in the room between the researchers and the consultants, and we thought through what that was all about. What it's all about is that researchers focus on what's not known. We're always looking for the next research question. We always focus on loose ends. It's the things that don't fit that motivate us. Consultants, on the other hand, focus on what's known, and they focus on putting it into a neat package and tying it up in a bow and presenting it to you. So we're knowledge-driven. Researchers are driven by what the problem's about, whereas consultants are client-driven. And researchers are always looking for new studies. It's not the case that one is better than the other. They're different and they meet different needs. So without consultants, knowledge would never get packaged up and presented to people. So I was reflecting yesterday on what Nan Walker was talking about. She's actually an archetypal consultant, if you like. She's presented a fabulous package of knowledge to you to think about. Whereas researchers usually don't think in that way. We're always on about what's the next thing we can work on, what's the next thing we can do, and we're much less good at packaging together knowledge and presenting it. And so it's worth thinking about which of those things that you want and whether you're better off working with a consultant than with a researcher. So what to look for in a research collaborator? Can they provide what you want to achieve, the things that we've already talked about? What are they good at? What's motivating them, and what can you provide to meet those motivations, and would a consultant be better? It's also important, if you're trying to work with researchers, to think about whether or not students can be useful, because for academics, getting projects for students is always an important thing to do, and one of the good ways of possibly interacting is through students. So if you can get a PhD student, you've got someone who's prepared to work on something for 3 years. Problem is that they can be of variable quality. The involvement of their supervisors in the project might also be quite variable. Some will be very engaged, some will be very distant. PhD students have to have results, and PhD students have very different motivations for being PhD students. Some of them are people who have been out in the world, are mature age people, and there's probably even some of you in this room who've been practitioners for a long time and are going back to do a PhD to make some sense of all that knowledge that you've gathered. Some students are very career motivated, and those students need to be getting publications and grants as part of their PhD. So they can't afford to take too much risk in what they're doing, whereas students with other motivations can afford to take more risk. The challenge with the 3-year project is that they may not finish, so you might invest a lot of time in working with a PhD student and they may not then complete. Honours and Master's students are another option that you might think about. Those are usually 1 to 2 years. Again, you've got variable quality of who you might get. Again, you've got variable quality of how engaged the supervisors are. They can take a few more risks in terms of the problems that they address. And what I mean here is that PhD students really need a topic that they know is going to get results and going to get them a PhD at the end of the day. Whereas Masters and honours students can address things that are a bit more uncertain about whether or not it'll actually yield something, a bit riskier intellectually. Again, they've got diverse motivations, but if they're using it as a springboard for their career, again, they can be less able to take risks in what they do. And sometimes the questions that you've got, you don't know whether it's going to produce an answer, and it's worth thinking about how you marry what you've got with what they can provide. And then there are undergraduate projects. These tend to be very short-term, usually days or weeks. Again, you've got the variable quality issue. They can take the most risks of all, but they also need to do something that can get them a good mark. So if you're trying to engage with researchers, it's worth thinking about these kinds of issues in making that a collaboration a good experience for both sides. Let me just finish this part of the talk, because I'm going to talk about some other things as well, by talking about one way of looking at collaboration. So I look at collaboration as about being fundamentally about difference. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to harness good differences, you're trying to harness the reasons why you're working together. You know something, the other person knows something, and together you're going to know something even better. And you have to manage the bad differences, so the things that get in the way of collaborating. Those are things like personality conflict, different motivations, things like that. So harnessing good differences involves thinking about what are the mutual advantages and how can you get the most out of what each of the parties brings to the table. Managing bad differences is what's likely to get in the way of this collaboration and what characteristics of the partners might get in the way of the collaboration. Does that all make sense? Thank you for the nods. All right, done that bit. Now I'm going to change tack, which is what the sailing boat's about, and talk about something completely different. And I'm going to talk about the value of theory. Who thinks theory is a waste of time? Oh, nobody's game enough to say. Who doesn't know? Oh, you all think it's a good thing? Yeah, cool. I'll just skip over that part of the presentation then. One of the things that researchers are good at is explanatory theory. And what I want to talk about is the value of how theory is example. But Nan Walker yesterday also talked about, gave you a theory about communication strategies that was a very useful, that I know from talking to you, because that was kind of the buzz yesterday, was many of you found very helpful. So what I'm going to do today is talk about political science theory and how it can better help us understand government policy making. Because I think many of you are involved in trying to get government to give you money or to do things or to change its policies. And this is a way of thinking about how governments work, and I'll be interested to see what Keith has to say about all this at the end of it. The first thing to say is that if a theory about anything, and this is no exception, tends to be complex. So one theory can't do it all. There's no one theory of childhood poverty that can do it all, and there's no one theory about how our policy gets made that can do it all. And so what I'm actually going to do is to give you 3 different theories and look at what they might work together. But I'm going to start with this lovely quote from Godfrey Sachs from 1869, which is that, there are 2 things that you should never watch being made because it's way too messy and you won't want to eat what there is at the end of the day, or you won't want to use what there is at the end of the day. So I'm going to talk about 3 theories that I found very useful when I'm trying to think about influencing government policy making, and that I hope that you might find useful too. And they're the technical rational policy cycle, the response to interest group pressure, and entrepreneurs and windows of opportunity. So let's start with the technical rational cycle. Part of understanding how policy gets made is to understand that there's a cycle that happens, and I think the mouse will work. Is that going to work? Yes, it is. So an issue comes onto the agenda, there's an analysis of what policy there already is. We think about what tools we've got, what policy levers we've got to do things differently. A range of consultation goes on, there's coordination between departments, there's a decision gets made, it gets implemented, it gets evaluated. Often the evaluation is just who squeaks about it not working particularly well. And, whoops, I'm going the wrong way now. This was laid out by Glyn Davis and colleagues who've worked in government to help fledgling policymakers understand what it is that they're doing. And the reason why it's important for us is that it's important because of timing. If an issue is already at the decision phase, then for researchers and practitioners to come in with evidence down here, identifying the issue, this isn't working very well, is it? Identifying the issue is way too late. If it's at the decision-making phase, for us to come in and ask to be consulted, it's already too late. So the importance for us of understanding this particular theory is that it helps us think about the timing of what it is that we're trying to do. And so it's worthwhile having a good relationship with policymakers so that you understand where they are at in the policy cycle and how you might best have input into it. So it's too simple by itself, but there are elements that are useful, and as I said, it's useful for timing of interventions. So let's then look at a different theory that can help you think more differently. So a different theory is about policy being made in response to interest group pressure. And this says that public policy is the result of the bringing together of different interest groups, and many of you are parts of interest groups. Interest groups often combine. The jargon that's used for that is into advocacy coalitions. So policy changes when there's a change. Either there's a balance between existing advocacy coalitions. So what you can think of is that the policies that we have now are a balance, are a compromise that's been forged between different people who want different things. And if you want a policy to change, you need to upset that balance. Either you upset the balance between what's already existed, or you upset it by bringing a new advocacy coalition in, or you upset it by getting somebody who's part of what's happening now to change their mind. So research and practice can strengthen an existing advocacy coalition, or it can get together to form a new powerful advocacy coalition, or it can work on one of the players to get them to change their minds. So these are ways that we might intervene in the process to make it more likely that policy will do things that we think are important. The third theory, so that's helpful in terms of thinking about how things get made. The third theory that's helpful is about windows of opportunity. So that this thinks about policy and process and politics as being in this massive cauldron all swimming about, and every once in a while an opportunity arises and it gets feasible to do something that wasn't happening now. A good example is the intervention in the Northern Territory. Abuse of children got onto the agenda, people were worried about it, and it opened the possibility for a whole lot of stuff that people had been thinking about to happen. Let me describe this in a bit more detail. So a policy change occurs when there's an unexpected opening. It's got to happen in the right political context, and the action that's proposed has to be feasible and practical. And the entrepreneur, this is usually somebody who's within government who sees it as their role. So Peter Shergold was an archetypal entrepreneur. He was the head of Prime Minister and Cabinet in the Howard government. He really saw his role as being the kind of person who saw an opportunity, figured out what was feasible and figured out what could be done and brought those things together to make change happen. And let me give you an example of how that played out in gun control. Not all of you are old enough to remember the introduction of gun control in the 1990s, but the unexpected opening was the Port Arthur massacre in 1996 and the public outrage about what happened. The right political context was that it was very early in John Howard's prime ministership, and he was willing to take the risk and to wear the opposition. It happened at a time, if it had been just before an election, it would have been much less feasible for him to take the action that he took. And the action that was taken was practical and feasible. So a gun buyback scheme was introduced. People had already been thinking about those things, so when the opportunity arose, it was possible for them to say, look, here's something that we could do that would make change practical and feasible. So the issue here is to have a long-term interest in the problem, which you all do. You've all got a long-term interest in early childhood and how to make things happen, and to be able to recognise an opening when it occurs. To have relationships cultivated with policymakers so that when an opening occurs, you're the one that they call to say, listen, we've got an opening now, what do you think we could do that would be helpful? And to have some workable proposals ready. It's helpful if you've done pilot work, if you're on top of the experience that exists, so that you can say, look, here's something that's been shown to work in umpteen places, we've never tried it in Australia, this would be an opportunity to try that. So what I've tried to do by taking you through these three little stories is to do two things. One is to help you better understand policy making so that you can better target your efforts when you're trying to influence policy, but also to indicate that no one theory can cover it all, that different theories are useful at different times for different kinds of things. It's worth thinking about what the theory is that drives the issues that you work on. What are the underlying understandings about the world, the things that piece the world together for you that make sense? Do you need more than one theory? And is it time that you updated your theory? So there's some challenges that I want to leave with you. So let me change tack again in the last part of my talk and talk about some ideas about thinking about complexity, because this is the area where I've said is hugely important in the work that you do. You do really complex work, and it's an area where researchers actually aren't all that helpful, and we're becoming better at it. So the two things I'm going to talk about are understanding systems and dealing with unknowns. So let me just say a little bit about the work that I'm doing. If I characterise my career, I started back in the 1970s as an undergraduate, and people said multidisciplinarity is the way of the future. And I thought, that sounds really good. And I've spent my whole career trying to find where multidisciplinarity lives in a university. Where can I go to understand multidisciplinarity? Well, there isn't anywhere that you can go. You have to do it through a problem-based focus. And so what I've ended up doing is figuring out what it would take to build a place where people could go. And in universities, that kind of a place is a discipline. So I've argued that what we need is a discipline of integration and implementation that brings together everything that we know. Because the problem is, at the moment, everything that we know is very fragmented and it's very hard to get hold of it. There's actually a lot of knowledge out there, but there's no way of collecting it. So the three things that I'm interested in is how do we bring together knowledge from different disciplines and stakeholders? How do we do that effectively? And we think quite a lot about bringing together knowledge and translating it into practice. That's really what this complicated box says. So how do we translate what we know into what we do? The bit that we miss, and the bit that I've been focusing on, is it's not just what we know, it's also what we don't know. Because what we don't know is where the unintended consequences come from. So what I'm arguing we need to do is we need to gather everything we know about bringing knowledge together, we need to get more sophisticated at thinking about what we don't know, and then we need to combine what we know and what we don't know to support policy and practice change. So let me start by talking a bit about systems. And as I said, the Productivity Commissioner, Robert Fitzgerald, talked about this yesterday, the importance of systems yesterday. To put it in a nutshell, everything's connected to everything else, and I think everybody knows that. Trying to get a handle on the system only ever allows you to get a partial handle. You can never understand the complexity of everything. And it's one of the frustrations is that people think that they have to try and understand everything. Models are useful in trying to capture particular ways of looking at the system, particular angles on the system. So just like there's no one theory that can help you understand poverty, there's no one model that can help you, or no one system that can help you understand poverty either. It's too complicated, but models and systems views can help you understand a piece of it. So and what systems are about and what models are about are capturing key relationships and key features of the system. I'm going to talk about just one type of model to try and enthuse you about the ability to understand them. And this is a sort of modelling called causal loop diagrams. Has anybody heard of causal loop diagrams before? A couple of you have? Great. So this is a causal loop diagram. And that's the inevitable reaction, right? Some of you are old enough to remember when Barry Jones was the Minister for Science. And Barry Jones, as the Minister for Science, tried to introduce causal loop diagrams into the policy sphere, and the reaction he got was exactly the reaction that you gave to that picture. People were like, it was called the spaghetti and meatballs diagram, and people went, bloody hell. Let me show you why this is important and why it's an important skill to develop. What I want to do is to focus in on a small section and leave the rest to your imagination, because that's a bit hard to read. I've actually extracted it. And let's focus in on this. Excuse me. So this is a causal loop diagram about smoking and what influences people to smoke. So let's start with smokers. So you'll see that the number of smokers is a function of the people smoking. That's not rocket science. None of this is rocket science, right? And you'll see that there's a little positive mark there. The number of people smoking, the more people that smoke, the more smoking is seen as a social norm, as something socially acceptable to do. You see there's a little positive there as well. The more smoking is seen as a social norm, the more people start smoking, the more people start smoking, the more smokers you have. You'll see that there are positives all around there. That's what's called a vicious cycle. The more smokers you have, the more money tobacco companies make. The more money tobacco companies make, the more they can invest in, the more money they've got, the more they can invest in marketing. The more they can invest in marketing, the more they can make smoking a social norm. You've got another vicious cycle. So you've got two vicious cycles acting together. To try and break the vicious cycle, researchers start to think about the problems of smokers and start to show that there are problems. They start to raise awareness of the fact that smoking is problematic. People start to quit smoking, and so you start to reduce the number of smokers. The importance of causal loop diagrams is that it helps you understand vicious cycles in the work that you do, and to understand what you can do to break those vicious cycles. This one about smoking is getting to be a bit old hat now, because Australia's really pioneered efforts in tobacco control. But part of the success of pioneering those efforts is understanding these kinds of vicious cycles and how to break them. So one of the ways of breaking the cycle has been around stopping tobacco companies from marketing. And that effort has been incredibly powerful in breaking this particular vicious cycle, which feeds into this particular vicious cycle. So understanding causal loop diagrams is helpful in two ways. One, it can help us understand vicious cycles, and it's worth thinking about the vicious cycles in the work that you do. Let me just give you another one. So I used to do quite a lot of work on heroin dependence back in the day. People who are dependent on heroin tend to do things that they're not proud of to raise money. The nice thing about heroin, and so they get a bit ashamed about doing that, the nice thing about heroin is it blocks shame. And so you take more heroin, you do more things to get the money, you feel more ashamed, you take more heroin, so it's a classic vicious cycle, right? They're also often involved in crime, and the more you're involved in crime, the less employable you are, the more you're going to use heroin, the more you're used in crime, the more unemployable. So it's another vicious cycle. And it's worth thinking about what vicious cycles there are in the people that you work with and how you might break them. The problem is that being able to do causal loop diagrams is a specific skill set. You can do pretty naive ones yourself, but to be able to do the kind of sophisticated diagram that I put up at the beginning actually takes a set of skills. And one of the things I'm really trying to do is to push capacity building in the research community to build that set of skills. If we go back to that diagram, this looks at not just that set of influences, but goes right out to look at global influences on tobacco control and a whole range of different things. And it not only helps you identify vicious and virtuous cycles, but it helps you identify where there are key points of intervention. And so the ability to understand systems in particular ways can help you understand both what's going wrong and where you might intervene most effectively. And this is an area where we're not very good, we researchers are not very good at helping you practitioners or policymakers. And that's got to change. So let me set you some homework, given that we don't have a lot of time for discussion. Think about whether there are any vicious cycles in the problems that you face. Think about what measures are in place to break them, and think about whether there's anything else that you could try in terms of those vicious cycles. So there are two corollaries to systems thinking that are important for the kind of main message I'm going to try and give you, and they're about boundaries and framing. So because everything's connected to everything else, and because there are only 24 hours in the day, 7 days in the week, and we only live for an allotted span, we've always got to set boundaries around what we do. And where we set the boundaries around what we do is critical. So boundary setting is about what's it feasible for us to do with the time, money and person power at our disposal. We tend to be very limited in thinking about what we can do and where we set the boundaries. We tend to do them out of habit, what we're used to doing, and bring together feasibility. What I'm arguing we need to do is we need to get better at thinking about what the problem needs and combining that with feasibility. Let me give you an example, and that's what these keys are here for. The old story of the drunk looking for keys under the lamppost, right? Somebody comes up and says, "What are you doing, mate?" He says, "I'm looking for my keys." And they say, "Oh, let me help you look," and they don't find them. And he says, "So where did you actually lose them?" And the drunk says, "Oh, I actually lost them in the alleyway up here." What we do is we look under the lamppost where it's easy to look. What we don't do is look up under the alleyway. And what we've got to do get better at is getting torches to shine a light up the alleyway to find the answers that we need. And so that we can target what's most important about the problem that we're solving. So where we set the boundaries around how we look at the problem and what actions are possible is critical to how effective we're going to be. If you think about it, it's not that long ago that illicit drugs and mental health were seen as being two completely separate areas. And one of the good things that's happened is that they're now being brought together, that the boundaries being set in a different place to where it was before. The boundaries are both organisational and personal. So your organisation's going to have ways that it does things, and you're going to have ways that it does that you do things. You'll hear a lot about the importance of breaking down silos. It is important to break down silos, it's important to work across silos, but the reality is, because we can't do everything, because we've got to set boundaries, silos are inevitable. So it's not sensible to think about, well, we just got to get rid of all the silos. You can't get rid of all the silos because the world becomes unmanageable. Silos are what makes the world manageable. What you've got to think about is, are the silos helpful? Or is it time that we set a different set of boundaries around what it is that we're doing? So again, let me set you some homework. What are the boundaries in your organisational structure? So think about the mission statement of your organisation. Do they mean that significant aspects of the problem that you work on get ignored? Are there things that you just don't do because they're out of scope? Think about your own boundaries, the way that you approach a problem. Think this is your skill set, basically. So do they seriously limit your effectiveness? Do you think about what you can and can't do? What do you do about the things that you can't do? Do you think about who you can partner with to make those things possible? So let me move on to framing. So we've got to have boundaries, but we've got to think about what those boundaries mean and how we can do them most effectively. We've also got to think about how we communicate about a problem, and the boundaries are implicit in how we communicate. So we've got to communicate clearly, concisely and accurately. So let me give you an example of different framings of a problem. So if we look at illicit drug users, we can think about them as dirty junkies, we can think about them as cool nonconformists, and we can think about them as sons and daughters who've lost their way. And you can see that each of those gives you quite a different way of framing the problem. Cartoons are a terrific way of framing a problem. This is a cartoon that was made in the days when I was looking at whether or not we should prescribe heroin. And this is a powerful set of cartoons that Warren Brown did for the Daily Telegraph. This is a Mr. Whippy van disguised as or turned into a Mr. Trippy van. The person inside the van is Michael Wooldridge, who was then the Minister for Health, handing out free syringes to a drug user. In this case, the drug user is portrayed very much as a dirty junkie, right? This was a very helpful, very useful framing of the problem for the people who were opposed to a trial of heroin prescription. Very effective. So how you frame a problem is really quite critical. Think about homework number 3, and this is the last bit of homework. What's the image of the problem that you and your organisation present to the world? Is it clear, concise and accurate? Is it the image that you want to present? So let me move on to my favourite topic in the whole wide world, which is what we don't know. The interesting thing about unknowns is that it's a complete blind spot in the way that we think in Western society. We've got very sophisticated ways of thinking about knowledge. We've got really unsophisticated ways of thinking about what we don't know. The problem is that unknowns are unlimited, and research capacity, this is particularly relevant to you thinking about what you want done, research capacity is always limited. So one of the interesting conversations I had with Alan from Salisbury was that he said, look, we've got all this great data, we've got really good things that we want researchers to come and do, but we can't find anybody to do it. And that's always going to be a problem. Research capacity is limited. And one of the reasons why it's important to think about the collaboration with researchers is how do you get some of that limited research capacity to want to come and work with you? What is it that you've got to offer as well as what they've got to offer? So the reason why unknowns are unlimited is that we've got the world's always changing, right? We've got constant innovation, we've got new things coming onto the market all the time, we've got new viruses evolving all the time, things are always changing. Ongoing research is kind of a subset of that. Research always uncovers unknowns, and it's a bit of a joke, but it's actually the truth that the end of a paper is always about what we need to do next, because research doesn't just solve problems, it uncovers problems, and that's why part of research's orientation is about what we can do next. There are some things that we just can't know. There are some things that we just don't have the methods to know, and unknowns are also beneficial, and I'm going to leave that with you as a teaser. But the point of having the island is, if you think of the ocean as being the limitless sea of unknowns and the island being what we know, as the island gets bigger, as what we know gets bigger, the boundary, the shoreline, also gets bigger. So the more we know, the more we get aware of what we don't know. So the way we think about the unknown is the more we know, unknowns will reduce. It actually doesn't work that way. It works in exactly the opposite way. The more you know, the more you don't know. And I suspect that particularly the more mature people in the audience will have learnt that through experience. You think that when you're young, you think, oh yeah, I'm going to get this sorted. And as you get older, you discover the more you learn, the more you don't know. So one of the things we're not good at is different ways of understanding unknowns. And some of you might have seen this before, but I just want to give you this one window into different ways of thinking about the unknown. So there's what we know, pretty straightforward stuff. There's what we don't know. This is conscious ignorance. That's the second square up the top. Then there's what we don't know we know, so-called tacit knowledge. And again, Nan Walker gave a great example of that in her talk yesterday. So she talked about the fact that one of the things you realise when you're working with clients is that you know how to behave in a middle-class society, but they don't. And you don't actually know that you know that until you work with people who don't know that, right? So that they help uncover stuff that you take for granted. It's stuff that you know, but you don't actually consciously know that you know it. And then there's this wonderful field of the unknown unknown. And Donald Rumsfeld, and this is another one that got a big laugh when Donald Rumsfeld talked about it for the first time. This is where the tigers lurk, if you like. So what we don't know is the stuff that can bite us. One of the reasons for coming to conferences is that you find out stuff that you didn't know. And one of the challenges for us is to think about how do we manage the stuff that we don't know. I'm only going to talk about 3 strategies for managing unknowns. The one that we use, there are 2 that we use the most, reduction and banishment. So we try to get more knowledge. That's our primary strategy for dealing with the unknown, and the rest of it we put to one side. We say it's not important or it's not relevant or whatever. They're our 2 primary strategies. And if you go to universities and you're trained in a discipline, that's what disciplinary education teaches you to do. It teaches you what this discipline considers to be a legitimate unknown, and everything else gets put to one side. What we have to get better at is accepting the fact that we can't know everything, that there will always be some unknowns. And we need to be able to construct decisions and actions that take unknowns into account. So strategic forecasting can be really helpful for doing that. And again, this is an area where modelling can help. I'm going to leave you that as a teaser because I don't actually have time to go into it. I forgot there is a 4th set of homework. I do want you to think about what are the benefits of unknowns. Would you like to live in a world where there are no unknowns? And what would it mean for your clients if there are no unknowns? So think about the benefits of unknowns for your clients. I'm coming to the end, and I suspect I'm coming to the end of my time as well. So there are 4 things that I like to think about, and I've only talked about 2 today, systems and unknowns, but values and context are also important. And they're important for this reason. We all want to live in a perfect world, and the reality is that we can't. And we can't live in a perfect world because we live in a world that's a system where everything's connected to everything else and we can never get a handle on the system. And we live in a world where there will always be unknowns and we can't know everything that there is to know. There are also some issues around values and context that means that the world is imperfect. So how do we deal with living in an imperfect world? Well, there are 4 things that I'd argue we have to watch out for. One is overconfidence, so pretending that we don't live in an imperfect world, and hubris, which is the same thing, pretending that we don't live in it, that we can do it all and that we can live with perfection. The second is to go to the opposite extreme and say, oh God, we live in a perfect world, there's nothing I can do. We have to act because that's our job. The third thing is hindsight bias. It's always really easy to be critical after the fact, but people have to make decisions, including you, have to make decisions in the here and now, and those decisions have consequences. You can certainly learn from hindsight, but you shouldn't be hard on yourself if you got it wrong, because we all get it wrong when we're dealing in a complex situation. And the most important is that we shouldn't let imperfection provide hiding places for corruption and incompetence. So our job is to do the best that we can in the circumstances that we work in, and to work with others to do the best that they can in those circumstances too. So what I've covered are the benefits and ingredients of collaboration, what to look for in a research collaborator. I've tried to interest you in the value of theory. I've thought about, although you were pretty interested anyway, so it was good. I've tried to give you some ideas for thinking about complexity, and part of my secret agenda is to get you to become part of the push factor so that researchers pick this up. If you demand it, people will start to meet that demand. And I'm just going to rapidly whip through some resources that may or may not be helpful. This is stuff that I've been thinking about for a long time. There's a website that you can go to. What we're doing is gathering resources for synthesising knowledge, dealing with the unknown and bridging the no-do gap. And there are collections of those resources on our website. Looks like that. We've put together a compilation of dialogue methods. This is available free online if you're interested in that. We've done some work on knowledge brokering with Aracy and the Benevolent Society. So this is a book about knowledge brokers. It's also available free online. We've done some work on different ways of understanding unknowns. This one's not available free. I've worked with the police around unknowns and policing. That one's available free. And let me just conclude by getting back to what all this means for bridging the no-do gap. So in terms of bridging the no-do gap, there are some things that the no folks, researchers, are not going to be good at helping you with, and that's dealing with complexity, but we're working on it. Don't dismiss the value of theory in what you're doing, and don't dismiss the value of theory in what researchers can offer you. And then to understand the no-do differences, so that figure out what you want from the researcher and how to harness that, and what you don't want that's going to get in the way and how you're going to manage that. Thank you very much.